Sophia's Roulette Presents with Dr. Tamanna Khosla as our speaker, and I would like to open the floor to the esteemed and just absolutely most amazing human being that I've met in this world in my almost 60 years of living, Dr. Tamanna Khosla, a true force for good, and someone who I cannot help but to see to doing just amazing things in the world because she's already doing them. Tamanna?
Thank you. Thank you, Cynthia. Okay, so today we are talking about ethics of war. So we'll be looking at it from the perspective of just war theory and what are the principles which have been brought about by this particular principle. Now, war has been there since the time human beings have been there. So, it was there during the times of Plato, Aristotle, Socrates, etc. But it's now taken a new turn because of the nuclear havoc which has been caused. And so it's more important right now to think about ethics of justice. Especially right now, the situation is more important because of Ukraine and Russian war. And, the kind of... the situation right now world is in, for example, after earthquake in Turkey and Syria, US did not even offer aid to them, so those kind of principles are there, which people have to understand that, humanity, if it had to exist, it has to exist through brotherhood and sisterhood. Otherwise, it won't survive. So, okay. So just war theory deals with justification of how and why wars are fought. The justification can be either theoretical or historical. The theoretical aspect is concerned with ethically justifying war and the forms that warfare may or may not take. The historical aspect of just war tradition deals with historical body of rules or agreements that have applied in wars through ages. So, for example, the Geneva and Hague conventions are historical rules aimed at limiting certain kind of warfare, which lawyers may refer to as prosecuting transgressors. But it is a role of ethics to examine these institutional agreements for their philosophical coherence. So now, historically, the just war tradition is set of mutually agreed rules of combat may be said to commonly evolve between two culturally similar enemies. So, for example, right now the war between Ukraine and Russia is being is being held between two common sharing cultural countries. But when Americans attack, for example, Afghanistan, or when Americans attack, Syria or any of these countries, Iraq, for example, they are not similar countries, and chances of hatred and the chances of assuming that these are culturally different people, they are like for example, targeting Muslims or Islamophobia. So those things are there. So this has to be understood that in different cultural cultures or different religions, tensions can be more rampant than in similar countries. So yeah, so less than it is only when the enemy is seen to be people sharing a moral or identity with whom one will do business in the following peace that tacit or explicit rules are formed for how war should be fought and who they should involve and what kind of relations and what kind of relation should apply in aftermath of war. So this is, the rules are formed when the there is a feeling that this is our people, and we need to, for example, colonialism. It was a total different experience for India, for example, and so until the time that Indians had to fight their own indigenous way to deal with British. So yeah. Regardless of the conventions that have historically formed, it has been the concern of majority of just war theorists that the lack of rules to war or asymmetrical morality between belligerents should be denounced and that rules of war should apply to all equally. So the UN, for example, okay, the rules have to be for everybody, similar to everybody, and that is why we had League of Nations, for example, which was formed, which failed, but then came UN. But it's like hegemonically, it's been dominated by Western European and American countries, and so, but yeah, so similar laws have to be made for every country, not just one country. The just war tradition is indeed as old as warfare itself. Early records of collective fighting indicate that some moral considerations were used by warriors to limit the outbreak or to rein in the potential devastation of warfare. They may have involved consideration of women and children and treatment of prisoners. But like I personally, because I'm connecting it to Russia and Ukraine, for example, there have been massive tolls of children being buried, and and people being killed, civilians being killed. So I guess that's highly problematic. They may have involved consideration of commonly the earlier traditions invoked others have been deemed honorable. However, what is honorable is often highly specific to culture. For instance, the suicidal attack or defense may be deemed an honorable act for some cultures, but it's not for others. So, for example, suicide bombers, like in this side of the world, for example, that's cultural specific, and they feel that they go to heaven. So how do you kind of, understand these aspects are some of the research questions which I will have in my mind when I'm writing my book. And whereas the specifics of what is honorable differ with time and space, the very fact that sufficient one moral virtue is alluded to the great literature, Homer's Iliad, is beginning rather than war being is sufficient for us to note that warfare has been infused with some moral concerns from the beginning rather than war being a mere Macbethian bloodbath. So from the beginning, we had some notions, where, there were chances that, we need to be more just, so these principles historically have been there, that you are supposed to be just when you are dealing with people, especially civilians, or the ones who are not army people. Army people have people who are who are dressed in dresses. They have a different opinion about them, but there is some kind of at least universal acceptance that people, women, children should be left alone when these things happen. But for example, during Afghanistan war, Taliban, etc., no principle has been accepted. So and children have been, women have been raped, children have been exploited. So this is the whole thing. The just war theory also belongs to a long history. Parts of Bible hints at ethical behavior in war and concepts of just cause, typically announcing the justice of war by divine intervention. The Greeks may have paid lip service to the gods, but as with Romans, practical and political issues, the real politics was what Romans were based on. Nonetheless, this has been reading of political realists who enjoy the history of Peloponnesian War as an example of why war is necessarily an extension of politics and hence permeated by hard-nosed state interests rather than lofty pretensions to moral behavior. Although St. Augustine provided comments on morality of war from Christian perspective, as did several Arabic commentators in the intellectual flourishing from 9th to the 12th century, but the most systematic exposition in the Western tradition, and one that still attracts attention, was outlined by Aquinas in 13th century. He presents a general outline of what becomes the traditional just war theory as discussed in modern universities. He discusses not only justification of war, but also the kinds of activities that are permissible in a war. So he back then in the 13th century discussed about the fact that what war should be, and how ethical it needs to be. So I'm giving a historical background to what we are kind of going to discuss right now. In the 20th century, just war theory has undergone a revival mainly in response to the inventions of American involvement in Vietnam War. So for example, Richard Norman's Ethics, Killings and War Walzer's War and Justice, are some Nagel's War and Massacre, are some of the important aspects which works on this particular issue. Since the terrorist attack on the USA on 9/11 in 2001, academics have turned their attention to just war theory on attacks once again with international, national, academic, and military attention to just war, once again developing and consolidating the theoretical aspects of inventions. So the disciplines of IR, all science, philosophy, ethics, and military history courses are looking at this particular issue. What has been of great interest is that in headline wars of past decade, the dynamic interplay of rules and conventions of warfare not only remain intact on the battlefield, but their role and hence their explanation has been awarded a higher level of scrutiny and debate. Yeah, so now the just ad bellum convention. The principles of justice of war are commonly held to be having just cause. So what are the principles, on which a just war can be based? It's like having just cause, being a last resort, being declared by a proper authority, possessing right intentions, having a reasonable chance of success, and the end being proportional to the means used. Now, what do you think can be the right intention? I mean, I'm just wondering, how can you have right intention in a war? For example, like in Afghanistan, if suppose women are not allowed to go to schools, I guess, is world noticing? I mean, I guess there should be some better means than war to resolve these issues. Loan issues, when World Bank is donating loans to these countries, for example, they should stop them from having, there should be principles that, gender equality is must and it should take place where it's essential. And if they do not reconcile to this particular fact, then the whole issue should be done away with. They should not be given loans. So the pressure of that kind. But wars, being in the country for several years, etc., is a big no-no. So yeah. Well, while this provides just for theory with advantage of flexibility, the lack of strict ethical framework means that the principles themselves are open to broad interpretation. Possessing just cause is the first and arguably the most important condition of just ad bellum. Most theorists hold that initiating acts of aggression is unjust and gives a group a just cause to defend itself. But unless aggression is defined, this prescription is rather open-ended. For example, just cause resulting from act of aggression can ostensibly be a response to physical injury, an insult, a trade embargo, or even to a neighbor's prosperity. So, so this is the whole thing that, it can be because of all these principles, a war can take place. War should always be the last resort, according to just war theory. This connects intimately with presenting a just cause. All other forms of solution must have been attempted. All other forms, for example, diplomacy till the end should be resolved. It should be the only way to deal with war. It's because right now, because of Ukraine and Russian war, the whole world has got engulfed in problems. Be it Africa, be it India, be it Pakistan, everywhere. We have better things in life to see than just having a nonsensical war being taking place everywhere. So, for example, South Korea is giving weapons to Ukraine. Now, what is happening actually? What the hell is happening at the ground level? So, this is problematic. It has often been recognized that war unleashes forces and power that soon get beyond the grips of leaders and generals to control. So once the war is on the ground, nobody can stop it. It's like that. You can't, even the generals can't stop it. And so there is too much of fog in the war, but that fog is also a moral haze in which truth and trust are early casualties. So, I mean, the resulting damage that war wreaks tends to be very high for most economies. And so theorists have advised that war should not be lightly accepted. Once unleashed, war is not like a sport that can be quickly stopped at the blow of a whistle, and its repercussions last for generations. So, yeah, the notion of proper authority seems to be resolved for most of the theorists who claim it obviously resides in sovereign power of the state. By the concept of sovereignty raises a plethora of issues to consider here. If a government is just, most theorists would accept that government is accountable and does not rule arbitrarily. So if a government is just, it has to be answerable first to its own citizens. Why are you, for example, in Russia, there are people who are like against this particular war. Yeah, so no war is a just war. Actually, no war is a just war. But so I guess what I am trying to say is that like if there is any issue of exploitation of citizens because of their if somebody is being annihilated, if there is a genocide happening, then apart not just if not war, then diplomacy and pressurizing through other means is important. That's what I'm trying to say, Daniel. So yeah, but the concept of sovereignty raises a plethora of issues to consider here. If a government is just, that is, most theorists would accept that government is accountable and does not rule arbitrarily, then giving the officers of the state the right to declare war is reasonable. So the more removed from a proper and just form of government is, the more reasonable it is. Its claim to justify political sovereignty disintegrates. A historical example can elucidate the problem. When Nazi Germany invaded France in 1940, it set up a Vichy puppet regime. What allegiance did the people of France under its rule owe to its precepts and rules? A Hobbesian retention of almost absolute allegiance to the state entails the resistance is wrong. Now, the principle of jus and bello. The rules of just conduct within war falls under two broad principles of discrimination and proportionality. The principles of discrimination concerns who are legitimate targets in war, whilst the principle of proportionality concerns how much force is morally appropriate. A third principle can be added to the traditional two, namely the principle of responsibility, which demands an examination of where the responsibility in the war lies. Who is responsible? Once the war is propagated, once it's on the field, who is responsible? The politicians, the generals, who? So I guess that's important. In waging a war, it is considered unfair and unjust to attack indiscriminately, since non-combatants or innocents are deemed to stand outside the field of war proper. Immunity from war can be reasoned from the fact that existence and activity is not part of the essence of war, which is killing of combatants. Since killing itself is highly problematic, the just war theorists have to prefer a reason why combatants become legitimate targets in the first place. So even that has to be justified. Firstly, a theorist may hold, yes. So yeah, in waging a war, it is considered unfair and unjust to attack indiscriminately. And firstly, a theorist may hold that being trained or armed constitutes a sufficient threat to combatants on the other side, and thereby the donning of uniform alters the person's moral status to legitimate target. Whether this extends to peaceful as well as war duties is not certain though. Voluntarists may invoke the boxing ring analogy. Punching another individual is not morally supportable in a civilized community. But those who voluntarily enter the boxing ring renounce their right not to be hit. So you have entered the war and you have to face this thing. Conversely, in joining an army, the individual is said to renounce his or her right not to be targeted in a war. The bearing of arms take a person into an alternative moral realm in which killing is the expectation and possible norm. It is a world removed from civilian structures and historically has evolved rites of passage and exit that underlines the alteration in status for cadets and veterans. Yeah. So Walzer in Just and Unjust Wars claims that lack of identification does not give a government the right to kill indiscriminately. So just for your cause, you can indiscriminately kill your and other people's person. You are like, sending your army to the other, and you are, for example, in India-China war, Like lately we had skirmishes, and so obviously both sides casualties were there. So what the governments are doing, like after all, the person who is dying is somebody's family, so I guess they should be considerate about this thing. um, and I'm here not speaking like a realist, real international relations uh, person. I'm speaking here as a person who would want to have as many less casualties in the world as much as possible. And so yeah, others have argued that the nature of modern warfare dissolves the possibility of discrimination. Civilians are just as necessary casual conditions for the war machine as combatants. Therefore, they claim there is no moral distinction in targeting an armed combatant and civilians involved in arming. Some people get a kick when, civilians are killed. It shows that, war casualties are taking place, and, like this is the danger of this power. The more powerful the power, the more chances of casualties are there. And, they just go beyond anything. So the second principle of just conduct is that an offensive action should remain strictly proportional to the objective desired. This principle overlaps with proportionality principle of just cause, but it is distinct enough to consider it in its own light. Proportionality for just in bello requires tempering the extent and violence of warfare to minimize destruction and casualties. It is broadly utilitarian in that it seeks to minimize overall suffering, but it can also be understood from other moral perspectives, for example, from harboring goodwill to all or acting virtuously like Kant and Aristotle. So jus in bello requires that agents of war be held responsible for their actions. This ties in their action to morally generally. Some, such as Saint Augustine, argues against this assertion. Who is but the sword in the hand of him who uses it? It is not himself responsible from the death he deals. Those who act according to divine command or even God's law as enacted by the state and who put wicked men to death have by no means violated the commandment, thou shalt not kill. Whilst this issue is connected to the concept of just cause, it does not follow that individuals waging a war, just or unjust war, should be absolved of breaching the principle of just conduct. Readily, it can be accepted that uh, soldiers killing other soldiers is part of nature of warfare, for which soldiers ought to be prepared and trained. But when soldiers turn their beyond what is reasonable, then they are no longer committing legitimate acts of war, but acts of murders. So yeah. So the last point is, which I'm just focusing on, is just post bellum. It has often been remarked that justice, like history, is written by victors. A defeated army, and indeed the civilian body from which the army stems, should just be prepared to subject itself to imposition of rules and forms of punishment, humiliation, and even retribution that it will not otherwise agree to. The lives, values, and resources that have been fought for must not now be handed over to the conquerors. And put this way, when one readily imagines one's own country army falling to an aggressive enemy, the terms immediately appear fearful and unjust and may stir a greater endeavor to make the victory hollow by raising of guerrilla or even terrorist organization to halt the conqueror's design. Yeah, I'll stop at this. Yeah, please.
Well, thank you very much, Tamanna. I'm very grateful for that. And I got to tell you, probably well, I mean, you said a lot of amazing things, but my personal favorite was when you said you renounced the right not to be hit, like, because it's just so true. So at this point, we will open up the floor for questions. If you could just raise your hand or put in the chat that your hand is up if you have a question.
We have a saying here in the U.S. that strong fences make good neighbors. So from the idealistic point of view, yeah, we shouldn't have those weapons. But from the realistic point of view, wouldn't it be better if we are armed so that a foreign power cannot attack us? Wouldn't those fences be beneficial, actually?
I mean, yeah, actually you're right. But like, I'm just wondering, like, if a country for example, Pakistan, it's a poor country. India, we are a developing country. If we invest too much on weaponry, where do we have time on human resources? How do we develop that? I mean, that's a question. Obviously I understand from where you are talking, you're right, absolutely. But my other contention is that, how do you do this? Because, like, for example, India is surrounded by enemies. So if we do not have arms, like, that would be a problem. So, like, we have to be prepared all the time, so that, this is not what happens, like, for example, China is there, and, so the country has to be on guard all the time. But look at the situation of Pakistan right now. It's like totally nobody's wanting to give funds to them, but still they're waging war. So what do you do about these situations? I mean, I'm just wondering if they kind of spend 3% of GDP on their national money on this particular buying weapons from different countries and funding terrorists, etc. Then, how do they kind of survive?
Well, are you responding to Tamanna?
Yeah.
Okay, go ahead and respond.
Go ahead. Okay. So India and Pakistan fought 3 wars. Correct me if I'm wrong. But ever since they had nuclear weapons, they have not fought a war. And it's because there's that mutually assured destruction. They have that fear of each other now. So perhaps that helps.
Yeah, that deterrence is there. Obviously, it's a deterrent.
It's
nuclear,
a deterrent, yeah.
It's a deterrent, yeah.
Thank you very much, Tamanna. Did anybody else have a question? Okay, Tamanna, you are writing a book. Would you like to speak to that a little bit?
No, I'm writing a book, actually.
Right. Yeah, that's what I'm asking you to speak to, the book that you're writing.
No, I haven't started as yet. I'm just thinking about it because I'm writing I'm writing something on something else. But once that kind of get finished off, I'll write a book on war and ethics. So that would be a big project. So yeah.
Beautiful. We have another question.
Hey, Dr. So do you think that having an economic incentive to not fight, to not go to war, for example, the Iraq and Afghanistan war, in Iraq, the United States had no incentive not to go to war. They had an incentive to go to war, and same with Afghanistan. But in the case of India, in the US, we have an incentive not to go to war with India because we have economic ties there. So creating a system, an economic system where there is an economic interdependence would help to diffuse these problems.
Yes, I personally feel that it can, because most of these capitalist countries have that agenda. So because capitalism is now the ruling way of looking at things, be it China, be it North Korea, everybody is being, some kind of capitalism is there, it's like majorly capitalist. So everybody is looking at their economic prosperity, and as much as economy can be prospered, chances of tensions between the countries, and automatically I feel they reduce. So, I guess it's a better way to deal with the tensions between countries.
Thank you. All right, fantastic. Tamanna, did you have anything that you wanted to say to wrap this up with?
No, I'm fine with it. Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you so much for coming, and thank you so much for coming. What a beautiful turnout we had tonight. I'm so grateful that you were able to come and contribute, and I cannot tell you how much I appreciate it personally, and I imagine Tamanna does as well. Tamanna, always grateful to have you. You always have a red carpet in my Zoom room.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Cynthia.